Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the webinar on Montana's habitat lease. I'm Shaleas Harrison. I'm going to give folks a few more moments to join us. In the meantime, if you're already on, I'd love hearing about where you're calling in from and why you are here today and why you're interested in learning about the conservation habitat lease with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. While we wait for folks, I'm just going to go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Shaleas Harrison. I'm the Wyoming Resource Coordinator for the Western Landowners Alliance. I'm calling in today from Cody, Wyoming. I grew up on a small irrigated farm in the Bighorn Basin where we grow beans, barley, grass seed, and corn. So I'm well familiar with row crops and irrigating. And I'm really excited to talk about this opportunity with all of you. You know, the impetus of this webinar really grew from a panel that I was on with Amber. And I thought, this is something that I think Montana producers should really learn about and ask questions. So that's why we're here today. If you don't already know, the Western Landowners Alliance is a network of landowners working to advance the policies and practices that sustain working lands, connected landscapes, and native species. Much of our work is to support, share, and fine-tune the tools and services to support landowners who are interested in conservation and stewardship of private lands. And habitat leasing is one of these tools, and it comes in many different shapes, sizes, and programs. From federal to state. And again, just really excited that Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks is willing to partner with us and our membership to share about this tool that they have. Before we get into sort of the nuts and bolts, I'm just going to tell you how this program is going to shake out. I'm going to introduce the panelists. We'll go around and do a quick share. And Amber with the department is going to give a presentation. And then I am going to share a slide or two. And then I'm going to open it up for Q&A, and hopefully we can have a rich discussion of the with the panelists. So please feel free to drop your question in the Q&A, and our tech support will filter those to me, and I will make sure that they get answered. So, habitat, as you know, landowners appreciate wildlife across the country, not just in the West, but hosting them comes with a cost. Damages to crops and fences, diminished grass or hay production, or even loss of livestock due to carnivores. Lewis, could you pull up that photo I have of the elk and fence? And some of these photos are actually from one of the panelists' ranch on the call right now. So anyways, a habitat lease is a solution to some of these costs. It's an agreement between a landowner and a federal, state, or private entity that provides payment for maintaining wildlife habitat. It's really a win for the land and the wildlife and the producer. And, in exchange for maintaining that habitat, the landowner receives a payment for stewarding the land to offset these tools. We all know that private lands are really important. They hold a lot of biodiversity, sometimes more biodiversity that is on public land. So we want to keep those lands whole and healthy and working. And I've heard from landowners across the West that who really support this idea of habitat leasing. They like the idea of a term lease with provisions to maintain the quality habitat in exchange for a payment. However, I'll caution you that there's no perfect program for everybody. And unfortunately, that's just the truth of the matter. But regardless, I'm excited to weigh the pros and cons of this program with all of you. And it's really up to you all to decide if this is something that's good for your operation. And finally, I recommend that, these agreements are really serious. Please seek legal advice and talk to your accountant. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to some of our other panelists to introduce themselves. Eric, let's start with you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Eric Kalsta. I'm the Working Wild Challenge Director. I'm also a rancher on the Big Hole in Southwest Montana. We run cattle and sheep, depending on which operation we're on, the lower or the upper. And we've been severely impacted by elk for a lot of years. So I'm always curious to hear about these options, and I hope you are too. Thank you.
Linda.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for attending the webinar today. I'm Linda Poole. I'm the Working Lands Director for Western Landowners Alliance. I have a little place up here in Phillips County out on the prairie, and wildlife in so many forms can be a blessing or a real problem for us. And so I'm always excited to have things like this program with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to consider how we might be able to better exist and even profit from producing good habitat for wildlife on our places.
Hey, Esther, do you want to go next?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Esther Rodriguez Peterson. I'm the habitat specialist for Region 4 for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. So if you apply for a lease in Region 4 or pretty much anywhere further west, you're going to have to talk to me. So looking forward to speaking to some of you.
All right, Amber, take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Shaleas, and everybody else who joined today. My name's Amber Fettis. I'm coming to you today from Miles City, where my husband and I have lived for the past several years. Before that, we were both born and raised Western Montanans from outside Manhattan. Both grew up in ranching families around cattle, hay, cereal crop production. So that's the background that I started this program with, that and a background with fish, wildlife, and parks. And I've been really blessed to be able to combine those two passions at this point in my career, where I get to work with two of my favorite things, conservation and just some of the greatest working families here in Montana are agricultural producers. So I think we'll go ahead and jump right in and get started here. Let me share my screen. All right, Shaleas, can I just get a nod from you if that looks right out there? All right, perfect. So again, thanks everybody for attending today. Thanks to Shaleas and WLA for putting this webinar together. I'm really excited to visit with everybody today about our habitat conservation lease program. Taking a look at what we're going to visit about today, we're just going to start with a really high-level program overview. This is a newer program to our agency. A lot of people don't know the details. It's a great tool to have in your toolbox, but you kind of got to know what the tool's for. So we'll visit about that today. We'll talk about one of the components we get the most questions on, which is our access requirement. Then we'll discuss the payments and payment structure. We'll look at some examples of projects we've got on the ground right now, and we'll talk about the enrollment process. So habitat conservation leases, or what we call HCLs, you'll hear me use the two terms interchangeably today, are, like I said, a great tool for landowners here in Montana to use when working with our agency. Fish, Wildlife, and Parks' primary goal with this program is to make sure that we're ensuring long-term habitat conservation by reducing conversion and fragmentation threats. And that's a big sentence, but basically what we're trying to do is make sure that we're keeping the grass and the sagebrush right side up. We plan to achieve this by retaining substantial blocks of high priority native and restored habitat. And we're going to do that with 30 or 40-year leases. And the point of those leases is to keep working agricultural lands as working agricultural lands while allowing some public access opportunity and providing habitat for our wildlife. So looking at habitat, we've identified 5 types that are the most important for habitat conservation leases. And those are going to be sagebrush grasslands, mixed grasslands, intermountain grasslands, wetland grassland complexes, and then major river riparian floodplains. Those 5 habitats are the focus of our HCL program. You'll also hear me call them priority habitat. Obviously, as you think about your ranch or your property, very few of those are going to be made up entirely of priority habitats. We get that. We also understand that even habitats outside of those priority habitats still hold a whole lot of value for our wildlife. So because of those factors, leases that go into our program only need to be a minimum 50% priority habitat. So half of the place needs to be those priority habitats, and 75% intact perennial cover. What that means for you is that your property or the part of your property you enroll needs to be 25% or less farmed ground. That being said, we can adjust our lease boundaries to exclude farm ground as we need to. So if you have more than 25%, that doesn't necessarily exclude you from our program. Talking about HCLs in general, and as we look at this overview, one of the first questions people are gonna have is what's allowed. So what we are gonna allow and what we actually ask for and encourage is normal agricultural and land management activities. And we're looking for those to continue as they have been. I tell people a lot, we're paying you to keep doing what you're doing. So that looks like livestock grazing and then any infrastructure that needs to go along with that. So fencing, stock water pipelines, things like weed management. We expect and hope that continues, road maintenance, all that kind of stuff. Again, we're expecting you to keep doing what you're doing. What's not allowed in an HCL is going to be any kind of land use change that's going to reduce or eliminate habitat values. So as a landowner, if you enroll in an HCL, you're committing to not cultivate your rangeland or do anything like spraying or burning that's going to remove native vegetation. You're committing to not build or develop large-scale solar or wind energy. Just a note there, that doesn't include things like stock water. We understand solar and wind is an important part of that. And we encourage you to keep that up. You're agreeing to not extract gravel or to not have concentrated animal feeding operations in the lease boundary. Again, those are things that if they do happen on your place, we can certainly work around. We just exclude them from the lease. And lastly, you're agreeing to not develop mineral rights that you own with very few exceptions. Since this is a question I get a lot, any mineral rights that are owned by a third party are obviously outside of your control. So you're not agreeing to any third party mineral right commitments, just your own. A very important part of our HCL program is going to be the actual lease contracts. I like to be really upfront with this because it's important and it's legally binding. So those contracts, once they're signed at the end of the enrollment process, are recorded with the deed of the property and they run with the land. That means that the lease is going to remain active even if the property ownership changes. It would go on to the next owner. There are some options to buy out of a lease, but they do require paying back any time that hasn't been finished in the lease, as well as a 25% penalty. It gets spendy. The only exception to that is if you're transitioning into a perpetual easement instead. So Because of that, I always recommend that people give a lot of thought before they sign that contract, that they consult with their family members, that this might impact, and that they consult, like Shaleas said, with an attorney and an accountant through the enrollment process. And we'll talk a little bit more here at the end about what that process looks like. So you have an idea of the time that you would have to consider all those things. So another component of the leases, again, one that we get a lot of questions about is public access, which is a requirement. That public access requirement is determined by a formula that takes into account the size of the property. And public access needs to be given in the form of wildlife related recreation days. So things like wildlife viewing, shed hunting, fishing, or hunting. Out of the total number of recreation days that's required by each lease, a third of those needs to be given specifically as hunter days for hunters to hunt on your property. That being said, access is always managed by the landowners, and you have an option or all the options to manage that in ways that are going to work for your operation. You also have the option to consolidate more days into the hunting season if you prefer to have consolidated public access instead of access year round. Another point that I think is pretty important to consider, the hunting days, the recreation days, they're just if demand exists. So you don't have to go out and find people to hunt and recreate on your property. You just have to allow them to if they do ask. Habitat conservation leases are not going to prevent landowners from participating in other programs like PALA and block management with Fish, Wildlife, and Park. Block management is going to be a program that allows landowners to receive reimbursement through impact payments for allowing hunters, along with some additional requirements like signage and being published in an access guide. And then public access land agreements, or PALAs, are agreements that have landowners allow the public to access adjacent public lands across their property in exchange for a payment. Both of those programs can be very complementary to the access requirement in habitat conservation leases, but they are not required, and landowners do have the option of managing access entirely on their own if they prefer. Another question I get surrounding access is about liability, and I do really appreciate that I can reassure people that landowners allowing free public access are protected from liability in Montana by state statute. Fish, Wildlife, and Parks also offers a livestock loss reimbursement program that gives even more peace of mind. So you don't have to worry about financial losses through livestock or liability by allowing the public to access your property. Taking a look at that calculation that I referenced, for properties up to 3,000 acres, you have to allow 1 recreation day per month for every 300 acres. For properties over 3,000 acres, you allow 1 recreation day per week for every 1,500 acres. What that looks like in practice: if you have a 4,500 acre ranch, you need to allow 3 recreation days per week, which comes out to 52 weeks a year, or with 52 weeks in a year, comes out to 156 recreation days per year. Of those 156 recreation days, 52 days would need to be hunter days on your 4,500 acre ranch. Those 100 days need to be offered between our commission approved hunting season of September 1st to December 31st. So we've gone through most of the requirements, or at least the biggest requirements, of a habitat conservation lease. So now let's talk about the incentive you'd receive for participating in an HCL. Landowners receive a per acre payment, and those payments are based on a percentage of the average fee title value. The way we came up with that is we took a look at appraisal work that was contracted by Montana DNRC on state trust lands across the state, and we came up with an average for both western and eastern Montana. We then took 15% of that average and made that the payment for our 30-year lease. And we took 20% plus a 5% bonus and made that the payment for our 40-year lease. In addition to location within the state, being on the eastern or western side, payments are also affected by the 2 habitat categories, which is going to be rangeland, including 4 of those priorities we talked about earlier. So sagebrush grasslands, mixed grass prairie, intermountain grasslands, and wetland grassland complexes are all paid out at the rangeland rate. Floodplain riparian, so that's going to be major river bottom system bottomlands with substantial riparian habitats. For example, the cottonwood gallery forest you'd see along a river like the Yellowstone. Those are a second payment category. An additional factor that affects payments is going to be hayland and cropland. Landowners are able to enroll intermixed hayland and cropland as long as the property still meets the habitat requirements that we talked about earlier. The per acre payment for hayland is going to be 70% of the regular payment, and cropland is going to be 50%. So that is a lot of wording to bring us to this table where we can look at our actual payment rates per acre. For Eastern Montana specifically, you're going to start with a value of $85 an acre for rangeland under a 30-year contract and $119 an acre for rangeland under a 40-year contract. In Western Montana, those values are going to be $218 and $305 per acre. You can also see that we have a substantial increase in the value for the major river floodplain habitat. Down at the bottom of each table too, you can see the details for hay and cropland discounts. I'm not going to dig into all those here. You guys can see the table, and you'll also be able to see these values on our Habitat Conservation Lease website that we'll share in an email following this webinar. Gone over a lot of information here. So I thought the easiest way to consolidate this would be taking a look at some examples here as we move towards the end of my presentation. We're going to start with one project that we enrolled this previous year near Hysham for the fat fingers. You'll notice that the majority of this property boundary is going to be in rangeland, indicated by the gray area there. We also have some discounted cropland, which you can see is in the crosshatched area. And then quite a bit of major river riparian floodplain at the bottom boundary with the kind of polka dotted area. This property is on the Yellowstone River. You'll also see we did a relatively large exclusion for these landowners. They potentially are going to have some grandkids, even great grandkids, building on the property in the future. And they also wanted to make sure that they had a really wide boundary around their home in the center of section 34, where people weren't hunting close to the house. So we left all that out so we could make sure that they had a good safety zone there when they have hunters on their property. Looking at another example, we have the Fogle Ranch here north of Jordan. Almost this entire property was enrolled as rangeland with the exception of a couple areas of cropland that you can see with the hashed stuff there in the corners. And then in the top and right bottom corners, we do have some exclusions, the top one being for their house and outbuildings, and the bottom ones being because they weren't sure what they wanted to do with those sections down the road, and we were happy to accommodate that. Lastly, let's look at a lease that we again completed in this last year with the Gregg Ranch near Sand Springs. This lease again is going to be mostly rangeland, but Mr. Gregg had some old CRP that he thought he might want to keep haying in the future. So we put that in the polka dotted area here is all hayland. So that's discounted now and he can continue to hay that as he needs to. You can also see a small exclusion there towards the center of the bigger parcel for his home and outbuildings. Hopefully now you have a pretty good understanding of what an HCL requires, what your payments look like, and how we can build those maps to accommodate your needs as a landowner and producer. So let's talk a little bit about what enrollment looks like. One thing that I like to make clear from the beginning is the enrollment process takes 6 to 12 months to complete. This isn't a thing where you apply one day and you have a check the next month. It takes us a little while, and I'll go through here why that process is a little bit more time consuming than you might expect. We start by taking applications once a year, and what a coincidence that enrollment period for 2024 is open right now, and it's going to be open for the next month until November 30. So if you're interested in applying, you can find that application on our website, which again is going to be emailed out after this webinar. The application's pretty darn straightforward, but Esther and I are always happy to help you apply, as well as Sky, our other habitat specialist. Once we get all of our applications in at the end of the application period, we take and we rank all of those to determine which ones we're going to be able to fund. An example of what we're going to be looking at to rank those projects, we're going to look at project size and configuration, with bigger whole parcels receiving more ranking points than smaller parcels or properties that are broken up into multiple pieces. Anything that has non-target habitat like hay ground or cropland receives less points than a property that has more rangeland. Anything that's adjacent to public land and expands our habitat protections or opens up public access into that public land receives some extra points. Projects with priority habitats like sage grouse core habitat, grassland bird breeding habitat, or higher levels of nesting duck pairs receives additional points. You receive points for the longer 40-year commitments. You receive points if your property is at a higher threat of things like cultivation or development or subdivision. And then you can receive more points if you're willing to commit to higher levels of access than the minimum requirement. Once we complete that ranking, all of our applications selected to proceed go through several more steps. And this is where we get into the more time-consuming process that does take 6 to 12 months. We do field reviews on site at each of our projects and work with our landowners to create those maps in ways that are going to accommodate the future of their property and how that needs to work for them. Our lands unit does title research to ensure that our leases are correct legally, that the deeds and ownership of properties is exactly what we think it is. Once those two steps are complete, we go forward with a public notice process where we inform the public about the proposed project and take public comment. Assuming we don't find anything new through those steps, we take these projects before our commission and land boards for review and approval. And that's when we can go ahead and sign our contract and get our landowners their payment. Just to be really transparent, this project doesn't take a significant amount of work or invested time from the landowner. That's all done by the habitat specialists like me, Esther, and Sky. But it does take patience. So I like to make sure that people understand from the beginning that it's going to be probably a full year before you have a payment in your hand. So just to reiterate, our 2024 application period is open. I always tell people your application does not obligate to continue, but it does make sure that you keep that door open for a project this year if it's something that you're interested in. So if you're on the fence, reach out to a habitat specialist, see about getting an application in so we can talk through the details of your specific property and operation and what that might look like for you. Watch for an email after this webinar. That's going to have our contact information, our website address, and all the information you need to contact us for specific questions. One other point that I like to make is if you'd like to talk to a landowner who's enrolled in one of these leases who can share their experience, reach out to us and we can get you in touch with those folks as well. Contact information for each of us. Again, I believe Shaleas will be able to help us share this after the program. And I think she is going to be up next.
Thank you, Amber. I know we have lots of questions, and trust me, I'm going to leave 25 minutes for a good discussion on those. I think I might be able to answer some of them already with a comparison table that I'm going to share right now. And this was a great exercise for me. I wanted to compare and contrast the differences between the Montana habitat lease with grassland CRP, that is another form of a habitat lease, and of course, a conservation easement, which is not a lease because it's really typically perpetual. But the length of contract varies between Montana's lease, which is 30 or 40 years, and the USDA's habitat lease through grassland CRP is 15 or 10 years. The land valuation process is completely different with each one of these programs. You just heard Amber sort of delineate a little bit where they got their values, but they're regional, and they're an average of those regional values. 15% for a 30-year lease and 20% for, or excuse me, 15% for a 30-year lease and 20% for a 40-year lease. And those varies differ between the eastern and western range, and there's some variation depending on the habitat types. Obviously, they had to use a model and extrapolate it. They don't have the staff capacity to go out and have an appraiser go to everybody's property to figure out what the 15% is or what have you. So I guess it's like kind of take it or leave it. If you don't think that price is fair, you don't have to sign up. Now, the USDA's habitat lease is based off 75% of the cash rent values that they get for the county. They send surveys every year. I always encourage our membership and producers to fill those out, because that is what determines the CRP rates. Of course, the USDA has a $13 minimum, which I'll talk about in a moment. And a conservation easement, it really is so specific to that property. You are going to be compensated for being close to town or being in a high development zone. And, these are valued pretty specifically. They take the before and after values of what the land would be at its maximum without the easement, and then taking away that development right. And that difference is really the value of the easement. And I've been told this year by my colleagues at Land Trust, that's typically 30 to 60% of the actual value of the property. The price, I wanted to break this down in price per acre, because it does show a difference. The Montana's lease ranges from $2 to $7 an acre per year, even though you're getting a one-time payment. That's what it eventually breaks down to. Now, I calculated this for rangeland only. I did not include the high values that they include for major river floodplains, or excuse me, riparian areas, which is upwards of $1,000 in the Western Range. Habitat leasing through the USDA's program is, and I took these values from this year's sign up. In every county, it was a $13 minimum, minus the counties that surround the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Those are $18 an acre. There's an incentive there because you're in a priority area, and that applies to Beaverhead, Carbon, Gallatin, Madison, and Sweetgrass counties. And of course, the price per acre varies with each conservation easement. The payouts are one time or over 2 years with Montana's lease. And with the USDA's CRP, it's every year for the duration of that contract. And of course, conservation easement can be a one-time payment, including federal tax incentives, or just federal tax incentives, for example, if it's a donated easement. The land types are pretty similar for Montana's lease and grassland CRP. They're protecting native habitats, prairie habitats, grasslands, sagebrush. They're not really including conifer forests. And the grassland CRP has a 5% maximum that you can have on your land with trees. And of course, a conservation easement, they take, consider any habitats and it can include cropland. And of course, the land type, the habitat lease with Montana's department can include a little bit of cropland, as Amber alluded to. Amber, are you guys able to pay more for that cropland that's enrolled in the program?
I'm sorry, we have a discount on the cropland. So you can enroll cropland in our program as long as it's less than 25% of the total, but it comes at a 50% discount.
I don't know what that means. Help me. What do
Yep,
you
so
think?
the per acre payment, depending on what you qualify for. So say in Eastern Montana, you went with a 30-year lease, you would be getting $85 an acre. If you enrolled cropland, you would receive half of that $85, so $42.50, but then you have the ability to continue to farm on that.
I see. Thank you.
Yep.
The competitiveness of these three opportunities also varies. The Montana's lease, of course, you're only competing against everybody else in Montana, and the department has a way that they rank those applications. It's likely less competitive than the USDA's program, which is it's national. It's a national program. You're ranked against people in Iowa and Connecticut and Wyoming. However, if you are in a national or state priority area, or are a first generation farmer, and there's some other things, you get higher ranking in your application. And just so you know, if you're curious about Grassland CRP, we do a webinar every sign up on these. I know lots about this program. You're welcome to reach out. And of course, the competitiveness with the conservation easement varies. You have to get a willing land trust. If it's funded through partial NRCS funding, there's a ranking criteria for that. So it really varies with a conservation easement as well. Some of the contract requirements, of course, vary as well. Montana's habitat lease does require recreation access. And I want to be clear that that's not really embedded in the valuation of that lease. It's something that goes with the contract. And for example, if you did have recreation and a conservation easement, you would likely be getting compensated for that. And there's no recreation requirement for grassland CRP. There's also no grazing plan for the habitat lease with Montana. They're just mainly concerned that you're keeping it in agriculture. There is a management plan associated with that with grassland CRP. And of course, a conservation easement, typically no. If you are, you're getting paid for that. The development requirements are pretty similar, and it looks like a little bit of cropping is possible with Montana's lease. You cannot turn your native habitat into row crops with a with a grassland CRP. And it really depends with a conservation easement. I've seen easements where you can't, and I've seen easements where they just want that cropland to stay cropland, for example. The monitoring is every 2 years with the Montana's lease. And on average, with the habitat lease with USDA, it's once every 8 to 10 years, could be more, but that's the average. And a conservation easement is typically monitored every single year. Before I open it up to questions, I'm sure there's a million, I still have several to ask, Amber. I really like to give producers this idea of layering and different options. You don't have to choose just one of these for your operation. You might have a conservation easement on some portion of your land, and that does not necessarily disqualify you from also enrolling in a habitat lease with the USDA. I can talk more offline about that. But you could also, on another adjacent property, have a habitat lease with the department. So really, it's a range of opportunities, or you could have none of them at all. So I have a producer in Montana who's interested in having CRP on some land and Montana habitat lease on another portion. And she also has a conservation easement. So I know that you cannot have a conservation easement and a Montana habitat lease on the same land. So that is not possible, but just think there's flexibility and options here. With that, I am going to, gosh, we've got a lot of questions in the chat. And before, I know this one came up. Amber, could you go through an example with us on what happens if someone needs to break their contract with the department? What sort of penalty is going to be in that contract? And could you walk us through an example, maybe a simple one mathematically?
I would be happy to do that. And I think I saw it in the Q&A, somebody brought that up too. I think it was Kim Bennett. She made a really good point here that it's very important that people understand the impact of being able to get out of these leases, because while there is an ability to do that, a buyout clause in the lease, it's expensive. So if we look at an example, that'll give us kind of some concrete numbers to think about. Let's just say that a producer, just for easy math, was paid $100,000. That was their lease amount for 40 years. If they wanted to buy out halfway through, so let's say they made it 20 years, they decided that they wanted to buy out because they were going to sell that property for whatever reason, or they wanted to make changes to the management. So they would have to pay back the remaining 50% of that lease. So if it's $100,000 payment, 50% is going to be $50,000. On top of that 50% of the payment, because they didn't use 50% of the time or didn't put in 50% of the time, they also have to pay a 25% penalty off of the original payment amount. So that's going to be 25% of 100,000, which is 25,000. So if you made it halfway through your $100,000 lease, you would have to pay back $75,000 to buy out. So it's not, super economically promising to plan on a buyout in the future. And that's intentional. We want people to stay in these leases. It's a significant investment on our part. One other thing to think about, you do have to be in a lease for 5 years as well before you have the ability to buy out.
Thank you. And if you didn't see your question quite answered sufficiently, just let us know, type it again. I'm going to move along. This is from Wade. In addition to Kim's question, how were the payment percentages 15 for a 30-year lease and 20% for a 40-year lease determined? I know you touched on that. Maybe you can touch on it one more time.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think maybe I didn't even actually touch. I said we determined 15 and 20%. I think he's trying to figure out where those numbers come from. Initially, that wasn't the payment level. Our very first iteration of this lease program, they were significantly lower. Our director's office wasn't pleased with the number of applications we got. And so they went back to the drawing board to come up with a number that would be a little bit more enticing for producers. The flip side is you can't go too high because we don't want to be paying for a perpetual easement when we're only getting a lease. So they kind of settled on that number as an in-between area where it might be high enough to generate interest and be compensating people for what they're doing, but not so high that we're in the realm of a conservation easement payment.
Sound good. Thank you. Let's see. I'm getting a lot of questions. Be patient with me, please. Can a landowner donate a portion of the property in this habitat lease to mitigate the tax implications from the income of the lease payment?
We don't have anything in place to make that happen right now. That's not to say it couldn't happen. That's kind of a one-off that we would want to pursue on an individual basis, I think. Just because things get more complicated in these leases doesn't mean we can't do them. We kind of work on one-offs all the time. So for whoever asked that or anybody else who's intrigued by that, don't let it prevent you from reaching out to me.
I have a question here from Mitch. Can a property be in both the HCL and FWP sage grouse mitigation program?
I'm not familiar with exactly which program you're referring to, but we do overlap with a lot of our programs. We've got some different upland game bird programs that we can definitely overlap with. And then we also have some older sage grouse leases that we did back in the day, where we can look at doing some discounts if we need to account for overlapping protections. We don't like to double dip with taxpayer money and pay you for the same thing twice, but that doesn't mean that there's not a lot of new requirements in this lease that weren't in the old one. So I actually did one of those, or I'm working on one of those right now. So again, we can do stuff like that all the time. We just look at it on a one-on-one basis.
And I have been getting a lot of questions about, oh, this is just like, or this is the same thing as the block management program that the department
Mhm.
has. Please
Mhm.
explain the difference of access and the advertising of that access that varies between this program and the block program.
That's a great question, Shaleas. So block management is a program specifically for access that's made to get access information out to the public. We advertise it quite a bit. We have guides available in every license provider. They're mailed to people. Block management is on phone apps like Onyx. It's really, it's out there for everybody. Properties have signage. A lot of times all you have to do, depending on the type of block management, is just sign your name and you can go. And people are compensated accordingly. This program, while it can work with block, is much more low-key. The access information is just published in one place on our website. It's not in any of our access guides or anything like that. You don't have to put up signs. You don't have to use agency permission slips. Management is purely on the landowner with much less publicity.
And you may have touched on this, but you could, in addition to this, also enroll in the block management program and get payment for that. And it does not interfere with the terms of this lease.
Correct. The two can overlap.
I have a quick question about the source of the funds for this program. And then after that, I'm getting still some more question about market values and the department establishing these fees. Could you just touch on that one more time as well?
Sure. I'm sorry. What was the first part of that question?
The source of funding that the
Yep.
department is using to fund this program.
Mhm. So we get our funding from a few different sources, a lot of Pittman Robertson money, and then some Habitat Montana money, and sometimes some other smaller areas that we pull money from, but those are going to be our two main sources. As far as getting into the property valuation, that's a question that we get a lot, and it's a little bit difficult for us to dig into because I think a lot of people think on terms of easements. When you're doing an easement, it is a much longer process for one thing, and it's also much more in depth. You're going to be looking at appraisals specific to your property, and then prices are determined based on those appraisals. And because it is looking at each property, it's much more expensive and in-depth and much harder to do. When we went with the Habitat Conservation Lease program, we just created that average so that we have the ability to get paychecks in producers' hands faster within that full year. So we take the average of land values based on state trust lands from DNRC appraisals, and we use that average for everybody. There's going to be, some people who don't feel like the value of their property is reflected in that average. And we understand that. That's why this program isn't for everybody. But for the people who don't have the resources, the time, or the desire for a perpetual easement, this is a little bit better fit.
Linda, I'm not seeing the question on tribal reservations. Could you ask that?
Yeah, thank you. Wade McAlpin asks, are lands within the Indian reservation boundaries eligible for this program?
They're not, unfortunately.
Even private lands within the
Even
reservation?
private lands within the reservation boundaries are excluded.
Do you have any explanation as to why? Do you
Esther,
know?
can you speak to that one? I know you've been
Sure.
dealing with this before.
Yeah, so the reservations are the tribes are sovereign nations within the United States. So the federal government can do easements, CRP, whatever. But since the reservations are not Montana lands, we cannot do leases on them. It would be similar to us trying to do a lease in Canada as far as legality goes.
Okay, let me see. And Eric and Linda, help me filter some of these questions. I'm just going through here and I definitely want to highlight the most important ones. Are there any glaring right now? We still have plenty of time to answer more of these.
I think that the one that I'm seeing that's coming up is the difference between a perpetual easement and these in terms of valuation and in terms of commitment. And I know that you covered that really well, Shaleas, in your table there, but I wonder if Amber or Esther would like to speak to that from the viewpoint of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Why do you see this as an important alternative?
Esther, do you want to take that one or do you want me to?
Yeah, sure. So a lot of landowners that I've spoken to really just don't want their land to be locked down forever. It's just something that they want to make sure that their kids or their grandkids kind of have an option to choose what to do with the land once the lease is up. So from the landowner's point of view, what I've gotten is a lot of landowners who say, well, my kids, might sell the land as soon as I'm gone. And I'd rather if they were a little bit more mature before they make that decision. And so they want to put it in a lease or they need that little bit of financial boost for their ranch, but they really don't want to be locked in forever. Does that kind of answer your question or?
Yeah, I think that's great. And one of the used to work in conservation easements a little bit, and one of the things that came up is you're offering me money based on current values. And with easements, it's a forever thing. And we know that land is generally accumulating value. And so Kim Bennett has a question in the Q&A. Please also address valuation issues for these long-term leases regarding lending appraisals and loan to collateral on properties being affected by the loss in value. Do the banks have to subordinate to the lease? So tangentially related to what we were just talking about.
Definitely. We avoid talking about any specific loss of valuation because of these leases. That's going to be more of an easement thing. That level of appraisal and property value isn't something we speculate on with leases intentionally because these are a tool made to be quicker, to be shorter term, and to get money in people's hands faster. So I'm not going to weigh in on valuation. That being said, it does have some impact. I mean, we can all agree on that. That's just common sense. And again, we really encourage people to consult with attorneys and accountants to figure that out and see if it's the right fit for them. As far as bank loans, liens, and collateral, we do require that banks at the very least are willing to sign a letter agreeing to the terms. So we don't require an actual legal subordination form, but we do require a notarized letter from the bank that they're okay with you going forward with this lease.
Yeah, and I think it's a safe assumption. And Kim, please type if I'm on the right track here that, obviously conservation easement is going to affect the value of your land. And this habitat lease will also impact the value per acre of your land. Am I correct when I say that, Kim? And just so you know, Kim Bennett is with Terra Western Associates. She's a a very experienced appraiser and has done appraisals here in Wyoming and also Montana. So I would offer to give you her contact number, but she might get mad at me for that. Okay, let's see. I'm gonna, if there are any other questions here, we got about 5 minutes. Chet Work has a comment here, and he says, it seems like this program might underpay for smaller acreages and overpay for larger acreages. Was there a target property size when you set the value for these leases?
There's not necessarily a target property size. There's certainly a minimum. According to our environmental assessment, which provides the sideboards for our program, we cannot go under a half section. That being said, the ranking process does reward applications that have larger properties just because they provide more habitat and more connectivity. So again, it comes back to that same thing where this may not be for everybody. If you have a smaller acreage and you talk to us and you look at the value that we might be offering, you may say, that's not for me. But on the flip side, we really try and get to that middle ground where we've got, a good value for the producers and a good value for the agency. And I've I just finished up a lease on a half section near Webo, and I'm working on a single section right now, adjacent to a larger lease outside of Terry. So we certainly have had landowners with smaller acreages who feel like, smaller being relative, right? Who feel like they've been rewarded just fine by the incentives of the program.
I just
Thank
wanted
you.
to make, sorry. I just wanted to make a comment in regards to us trying to work with landowners to make things kind of a better deal for them. As far as taxes go, we are willing to split payments in half over 2 different calendar years to hopefully make it so you get to keep more of that money.
Typically when we do these webinars for a program, I have landowners that are actively participating or have experience. And I wasn't able to do that with this because I don't know anybody directly in Montana. And of course, there's some privacy concerns for the department asking them to be on this webinar. Amber, is there any way, folks on this call can connect with you and say, I just need to talk to a real person? Could you put me in contact with somebody that's in this program? Is that at all possible?
Definitely. Yeah. We've got leases active right now in northeastern and southeastern Montana. If you live in one of those areas, chances are or have at least heard the name of somebody who's in a lease. So reach out to us and we're happy to get you in contact with somebody who could tell you a little bit more about their experience.
Thank you. That would be really helpful. And Chet has a question about the connection of this lease to the land, and you covered this, but Chet, this is a lease that is it's tied with the land. If you sell the land, it is almost a covenant. It runs with the land for the duration of that lease. And there is, if you want to get out of the lease, there is a payment penalty. And what I'll do, I won't cover that again, but what I'll do is I'll send, after this webinar, I'm going to send you all a sample lease, an application for this program, a sample lease for this program, and it has that criteria in it, Chet, that shows you what you're going to have to pay if you get out of the lease. And of course, all the language around access and the formula as well. I'll have Amber's presentation, my comparative slide, and I think that's the slew of resources that you will all need. So with that, I think we're at time. I want to respect our panelists' time here and thank you all for coming and asking these hard questions. Again, this is a voluntary program. It is a serious commitment. We do encourage you to seek lots of advice from professionals other than myself. I'm not an attorney by any means, and and, you know, they're worth every penny when it comes to looking at any sort of contract. Any other closing words from a member of my team or the Montana folks on the call?
I just want to say thank you to everybody who came and also to the panelists. I really appreciate this information, and I hope our other people get something out of it as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you again to the Montana Department. This is a great opportunity for us to share this information. It's obviously heady and really complex, so appreciate both of your time and doing your best really to try to come up with a working lands program and a habitat lease. It is not easy, and of course, I'm sure in the future there'll be adjustments to this program, and we will certainly comment and share any, you know, opportunities for public comment on that. Like, this is a public agency. We need to do our best to make sure it's serving the people of Montana. So thank you so much, and you'll hear from me soon in an email.
Thanks so much for putting this all together, Shaleas.
Thank you.
Bye.